Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. Thank you all for being here and joining us virtually at the 10th Biennial Wong Center Symposium. Before we begin, I want to say I am honored to be here today to open up this morning's session. I would like to start off by introducing myself a little. My name is Alexandra. I am a first-generation undocumented student pursuing a math degree. I was born in Mexico, but I came to the US when I was less than a year old, which means I don't have any memories of my place of birth. And unfortunately, I can't travel there due to my immigration status. So therefore, Washington is the place I call home. Growing up, education was always very important in my household. It was seen as the only way to have a better future. And unfortunately, and therefore it became important to me. And is the reason why I decided to further my education at PLU, where I have become a student coordinator for Gold Group, which is a space for undocumented students on campus, and a Reiki scholar for the Diversity Center, where I have learned to challenge my thoughts, develop leadership skills, collaborate with others, and come out of my comfort zone. Furthermore, I would like to give a huge shout out to all my Reiki scholar peers in the DJS and others in the DJS coalition who are here gathered today in the Regency room. Thank you all for showing up. I really appreciate it. And now, before I introduce Elena, I would like to say a land acknowledgement. As we meet here today to listen to Elena present about UndocuJoy in practice, I want to first acknowledge and send gratitude to the Native people and lands of the places we call home. Since we are being hosted on many different lands across the globe, I would encourage you to get to know who the people of your place are. And as today's presentation revolves around healing through joy, I want to recognize that the lands we stand on today have provided us with many beautiful resources that we tend to take for granted. We need to care for this land the same way it provides for us, and we also need to respect it. We need to pay respect to current and past Indigenous people by learning, advocating, and caring for the land. I also want to acknowledge that PLU is on the traditional territory of the Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin Island, and Steilacoom people, who prior to the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854, which removed Native people to clear a way for colonial settlement, lived on and cared for this place as their ancestral land. It is important for myself as a settler who calls this place home to acknowledge and send gratitude to these people who continue to be leaders for justice in our community today. Lastly, I would like to acknowledge the violence in Ukraine and say it is very heartbreaking to see what is happening, and that my prayers go out to all the people and families who have lost someone during this time. And now I am glad to introduce Elena Calderon as our featured speaker this morning. Elena Calderon is a former undocumented individual who continues to advocate for undocumented communities. Most recently, Elena has explored the concept of UndocuJoy and what it means having grown up without legal status and what it means now as a permanent legal resident. She was born in Aquila, Michoacan, raised in Mattawa, Washington, and currently resides in Tucson, Arizona. Elena is passionate about her education and earned her Bachelor's of Science degree in Community Health and her Master's of Science degree in Communication Studies from Eastern Washington University. Elena was recently accepted to the PhD program in higher education at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona, and is in her first year of the program. Her goal as a doctoral student is to create an equitable environment in higher education for students, regardless of their legal status. And now, before we move on, I would like to let our audience know that you are all welcome to write your questions in the Q&A box. And unfortunately, the chat function will be disabled for this session. And now I will pass it on to Elena. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So I'm going to say it, I'm going to share my screen. We'll always have to say that at the beginning of every Zoom meeting, but it looks like my screen sharing ability has been disabled. So if I could have, oh, there we go. Thank you. If I should move the panel away. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Alex, for that introduction. Thank you to everyone who was able to put the Wong Center Symposium together, and to those of you attending this keynote. I believe I have some family and friends in the audience, so I really appreciate that as well. And I'm really excited to be here with everyone. And before I get started on sharing my message, let me first introduce myself. My name is Maria Elena Calderon Sandoval. I have 4 names, but I go by Elena. I was born in Aquila, Michoacan in Mexico, and at the young age of 4 years old, my family and I immigrated to Marable, Washington, traveling a total of 2,639 miles. And I don't know if I need to move this. No, apologize. But during this journey, when my family was crossing the border, we crossed the United States-Mexican border by foot through the desert of Nogales, Arizona. And we did this as undocumented individuals. And I was undocumented for 25 years. And while that status was difficult to navigate, I'm so proud of how far my family has come, all 2,639 miles. Currently, I live in Tucson, Arizona, which is about 2 hours from that same border that I crossed as a little girl. The title of my workshop is UndocuJoy in Practice, Healing Through Joy, Storytelling, and Therapy. And one of the reasons that I gave it this name is that for a while, I was stuck with thinking of how much my family's lives had been negatively impacted because of our border crossing. Growing up, I struggled with acknowledging other aspects of my identity because I was so focused on the undocumented aspect of who I was. So in this presentation, I reframe my experience through an UndocuJoy lens of what life has been beyond the border, because my story is not just about crossing the border. It's a story about my community, about familismo. It's a story about the defiant laughter and joy of my family and the community in the face of structured oppression. And it's a story about collective agency, where my family and community came together to participate and thrive in a society that was not meant for us. So I want to provide an overview of my legal status because there have been several transitions for me now. For 25 years, I lived as an undocumented individual. I went through different phases of legality and have been very fortunate to now call myself a legal permanent resident. This means that I have a green card that will allow me to work for 10 years. I also have a social security number, and this allows me to travel both in and outside of the United States. If I were to ever leave the US, I am able to come back. And I definitely recognize the privilege that comes with that. And growing up without legal status, it resulted in a unique upbringing that entailed being resourceful about the ways that my family and I navigated society. And as an adult, I started noticing that patterns of navigating society without status were starting to follow me in the workplace. For example, I had this fear of getting in trouble or something bad happening at work that would then result in me getting fired. And it was impacting my mental health. I soon came to the realization that I needed therapy to help me understand this trauma, a lot of trauma that I had endured as a result of my undocumented upbringing in a society that valued legal status over humanity. And I also want to point out that these different statuses that you see on this page, they're not linear, and that I didn't get behind any line to end up as a legal permanent resident. And this year you'll notice it says TBD, to be determined, but because I was able to become a permanent resident, that did offer an opportunity for me to eventually become a citizen. So hopefully this summer I'll be able to do that. And I also want to draw your attention to this graphic that I have here on the screen. This was initially shared with me in one of the many therapy sessions that I had, but this was to describe the process of healing and what that can look like. Our expectation is that healing is a linear process. You go to therapy and all the trauma's gone. However, the reality is when you are doing therapy and you're unlearning some of these habits, these thought processes that we've just been exposed to, because we're undocumented, healing is actually a very complex process. But I also like to use this graphic to describe what the process of legalization can also look like. People often think that, again, it's a linear process. You get in line, you follow the steps, done. But even when you do have a path towards legalization, it can also be a little complex. So when I was undocumented, I had no legal status. I had no valid social security number. But what I did have was a lot of anxiety, particularly about what my future would look like. And I would often think about these worst case scenarios for my family, which would end in deportation. That's what I would picture. And my therapist, she gave me a name for this unhealthy thinking pattern, and that's catastrophization. I had never heard of that term until I started going to therapy. And here's an example of thoughts that would go through my head whenever we'd hear that La Migra or immigration officers were nearby. I would think, what if I come home from school and my parents aren't there? Or what if La Migra ICE takes my parents while they're at work in the orchards? And growing up, we would hear stories about family separation, and I couldn't help but picture what this could look like for my family. This was my biggest fear. And this continues to be a fear of mine as I have a large mixed status family. And while that was only a fear of mine, the sad truth is that this really is some people's reality. This really has happened to them and their families. Kids have come home from school and their parents or guardians have been taken into detention centers. And the next day, these children are expected to continue on with their lives while experiencing an extremely traumatic event. Being undocumented, it shaped my worldview of how undocumented people were supposed to navigate spaces, particularly spaces that were dominated by white individuals. And it wasn't until I started going to therapy that I realized I had this fear of people who were in positions of authority. Because for someone that's undocumented, what we were told was to be humble, to lay low, and don't draw attention to yourself. And that's usually the opposite of someone that's in a position of authority. And when I would draw attention to myself, whether it was for coming out as undocumented, sharing my story, or being verbal about who I was, I couldn't help but feel scared, but also empowered at the same time. But I was scared because I was doing the opposite of what I had been told when I was growing up. I was not being humble about who I was, and I was not laying low. So this caused me to feel conflicted about how I saw myself, both as an advocate for undocumented communities, but also as an undocumented individual myself. These feelings did ease a bit when I became documented, which was when I did have access to a social and I was able to work. And I also want to draw your attention to the picture here. So this is an individual tax identification number. So when my family and I came to the US, my parents were able to get all of us an ITIN. And on it, it says not valid for employment. And then there's a number here that looks very similar to a social security number. But I remember my mom saying, if we ever do become like residents or citizens, like this is what our social would look like. And I was like so excited for when this day would eventually happen. And one thing I do want to share is that my siblings and I were actually able to take our ITIN that we had and use that as our actual social. So we did have to do a little bit additional advocating for us, like at the Social Security office. But it was really neat to see our ITIN number that was not valid for employment actually be used as a social when we had DACA. So in 2012, former President Obama signed an executive order known as Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. However, I want to emphasize the collective agency of undocumented individuals and allies in pressuring the Obama administration into signing the executive order. Prior to DACA being enacted, hundreds of thousands of us were having a difficult time comprehending what our futures would look like. And one of my older sisters, she graduated from college one day after that announcement was made, the announcement of DACA, the executive order. And it really made a huge impact in how our lives played out afterwards. With DACA, we could now actually picture a future in the United States. I was documented for 7 years. And this was when I started feeling more secure about my life in the United States. Having a social security number was the validation that I needed to pursue my higher education goals, like getting a master's degree and moving out of state. And there's also several states in the US that have enacted policies that specifically help documented individuals with things like getting a driver's license. So DACA really was a gateway for me to travel within the US. Now, prior to moving to Arizona, where I'm currently at, I made sure to do my research about policies in this state, and that's because I was documented. So I wanted to make sure that where I was going to feel safe in the sense that like I would be able to get a license. And one thing I learned moving to Arizona is that in Arizona, your driver's license is only valid up until your DACA or your green card expire. So for me, that was 2 years. That's something that's very important to know. And while moving out of state might not seem like a huge step, it was an extremely big step for me. I couldn't help but feel like DACA might get terminated, and it was a race against time to accomplish as much as I possibly could while I had the chance. And that's another thing that I want to highlight is as an undocumented individual, there's a lot of pressure to accomplish, the pressure to do, the pressure to go above and beyond because we were given access to a social security number. And I often think about people or individuals who don't have to think about legality as they go on about their day. For me, it has always been about legality because I felt that I had to prove my worth in this country. And these feelings stemmed from the push towards the DREAM Act, where dreamers were seen as kids with bright futures who were deserving of citizenship because of the contributions that they could make in this country. The narrative was that they were brought here through no fault of their own, and then the blame was shifted towards our parents. However, this dreamer narrative or good immigrant narrative, it perpetuates a system where citizenship is based off of who's deserving, who has education, whereas citizenship should be based on humanity. And currently, I am a legal permanent resident, and this is all thanks to having been fortunate enough to fall in love with a United States citizen. Good thing that he also fell in love with me. And due to a former immigration application from 1997, I was able to do my immigration interview in Phoenix, in Arizona, as opposed to having to go to my birth country, which would have been in Mexico and Ciudad Juarez. Normally, you would have to leave the country for this type of interview. There's also no guarantee that this interview will pass and that you'll be re-allowed to enter. So I was very fortunate to do my interview in Phoenix. But this 90-minute immigration interview was probably the most nerve-wracking interview that I have ever done. And while my marriage to my husband is 100% valid, you couldn't help but feel like you were doing something wrong when you're going through this process. And I was definitely catastrophizing as my immigration interview approached. I would think, what if I forget important facts about our lives? What if the judge thinks that we're not really married? What if my application is denied? What if I get deported? And I couldn't stop myself from spiraling into these waves of panic and these made up scenarios. I didn't realize it at the time, but I could have greatly benefited from having skills to help cope with this type of anxiety. And prior to having been married to my husband, who's a US citizen, I really had no pathway towards residency. Again, I want to highlight that this line that people often say to get in is non-existent. I wasn't able to go from documented to any pathway towards residency. It does not work like that. And in this situation where I was able to become a permanent resident, I want to acknowledge the familismo and the collective agency that was enacted in this situation. My husband provided me with the path towards legalization. My older brother provided me with financial support to pay for this process. As you can see, it's a pretty expensive process. And my community members wrote letters of support that were needed for this application. So now that you have an understanding of my own background with legal status and where I stand today, I want to share more about what this process has been like for me growing up and how I have processed these shifts in legality. And then this picture here was actually the first time I went to Mexico. I wanted to highlight, it's kind of me like just looking out over the ocean. It was beautiful. In 2009, I graduated from Walluk High School. And then after high school, I went on to graduate 2 times from Eastern Washington University. In 2013, I earned a Bachelor of Science in Community Health. And in 2016, I earned my Master of Science degree in Communication Studies. I love learning. And then in 2020, after working at Arizona State University for about 5 years, I decided that it was time to go back to school, but this time for the PhD, a degree that I had felt was out of reach because I was scared that DACA would get taken away or terminated. And you may recall that happened several times with the last presidency. But I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to finish a program if I had no status. Obviously, this is not the case, as I've met several individuals without DACA. They're undocumented and they have been able to pursue a PhD. So this was a barrier that I perceived. And when I became a permanent resident, I really saw no barrier preventing me from seeking out this goal. And in January 2021, I received my acceptance letter to the University of Arizona. So this leads me to where I'm at today, a first-year doctoral student at U of A in Tucson, pursuing my PhD in higher education. And as a lifelong learner, I often thought about the barriers that the Latino community faced, that undocumented students faced, that first-generation students faced. And I felt like I needed more tools and knowledge to help resolve the systemic issues that I was witnessing and reimagine what access and success could look like for these communities. And that's what pushed me and continues to push me to pursue this degree. So I want to tell you more about my undocumented upbringing. I remember when I'd hear my parents say, "Es que no tenemos papeles." It's because we don't have papers, legalization. When talking about certain programs to apply for, like food stamps, or when we weren't eligible for healthcare. And I would look around my house and I would think, but we have so many papeles here. Like, why can't we use some of these papers, these papeles? And obviously, I didn't realize what kind of papeles we didn't have. And for the longest time, I felt a lot of shame for not being a US citizen. I hated not being like my other friends. I liked being different, but not in this sense. And I especially hated having to explain to my teachers throughout high school why I couldn't apply to certain programs in school that required a social security number. And when it was time to apply to colleges, it was especially frustrating because I would tune out any conversation about financial aid. And at that time, financial aid was not available. I was not eligible for financial aid in Washington. That has since changed. But at that time, I'd hear financial aid and I was like, nope, tuning out. And it was really my senior year of high school when I stopped being resentful for being different and instead embraced the agency that came with my unique upbringing of being undocumented. And by this time, I was familiar with several individuals who were undocumented and were in college. And that includes one of my older sisters who went to college before me. So I was determined to follow in their path. I want to share more about when I learned about the word UndocuJoy. So 3 years ago, I learned about this word and concept called UndocuJoy, and it was actually by Luis Ortega, who you may know he's a storyteller in Washington State. But this word helped me embrace my background of being undocumented. It helped me see that not having papeles was actually one of my greatest strengths while growing up. So when I talk about being undocumented now, I do it in a way that incorporates joy because there have been so many moments of joy in my life, and I don't only want to be talking about my struggles. Yosimar Reyes, an undocumented poet, writer, and comedian, coined this phrase with the intention of shifting the narrative of what it means to be undocumented. So rather than focus on the gloom and doom of our status, Yosimar chose to focus on joy. The media often consumes and thrives on making undocumented people relive the trauma around our status. So with UndocuJoy, Yosimar wants undocumented individuals to be intentional when sharing their story, and it should be honored rather than used as clickbait, because our story is one of cultural power and cultural capital and one of joy. And when I learned about UndocuJoy, I was so inspired that I actually created a blog called UndocuJoy. I have the link here for my blog, but I started sharing stories that I didn't typically share, like in these types of settings or at school. I felt like UndocuJoy really did give me that permission to incorporate other aspects of my life that I previously felt I couldn't be talking about. And in addition to UndocuJoy, another theoretical framework that has really resonated with my undocumented upbringing is called funds of knowledge. And funds of knowledge are defined as historically accumulated and culturally developed bodies of knowledge and skills essential for household or individual functioning and well-being. And to explain the funds of knowledge that were evident in my undocumented household and my community, I'm going to provide an example of a deficit-based perspective regarding the term undocumented. So when this term is heard, it might be common to think about things that are lacking or missing. So for example, no legal status, no legal documentation, and several things we are not able to do. So in some states, you can't get a driver's license. There are specific policies in place to prevent this. To counter that deficit-based perspective, we can think about our unique knowledge and experiences that allowed us and continue to allow us to navigate a society despite not having legal status. So for example, growing up, I had family from California who learned that they could come to Washington to get their driver's licenses. Because in California, there were certain policies that didn't allow that. But in Washington, we were able to get a license. So we were able to establish our own network of support. And another asset-based example of growing up undocumented was how my parents were able to find work within agriculture and provide for their family. Legal status was not a barrier in that sense. And another example is they were able to establish a community of resources and individuals that helped them become homeowners, all with no legal status. And this is why I want to introduce this term in my presentation, funds of knowledge, to continue my journey in countering a deficit-based perception about undocumented individuals and demonstrate the wealth of knowledge that has been accumulated as a result of this status. And now I share a childhood memory, but through an UndocuJoy and funds of knowledge perspective. So let me tell you about the worst cherry picker there ever was. It was me, and it probably still is me if I ever have to go back to pick cherries. I'm the youngest of 5 children. I have 3 older sisters and 1 older brother. And when we first immigrated to Mattawa, my 4 older siblings, they were old enough to go to school. So they would go to school. But I was too young to go to school, and my parents weren't able to afford a babysitter. So off to the orchards I went. And looking back, I actually enjoyed this time of my life very much. All I had to do was fall asleep in a bin with my purple blanket, and then I'd wake up a couple of hours later. I would grab my cobija, my blanket, and I'd walk down the row of either apple or cherry trees, whatever orchard we were working in, and I would look for my parents. And from there, my job was to keep myself entertained. I'd make little houses out of sticks. Sometimes I'd get to rescue a baby bird that had fallen from a tree, or other times I'd just be snacking on food throughout the day. I was like, yeah, this orchard work, it's not too bad. I was living my best life, but that's because I wasn't actually working. But then I got older and it was time for my first job. No longer was I allowed to fall asleep in a bin, in a cherry bin or like an apple bin. I now had to wear a cherry bucket and actually work. Can you believe that? A 5-year-old having to pick cherries? I didn't think it was fair. I deserved to be sleeping comfortably in a bin. And because my family grew up, financially struggling, my parents had to have us work when we were old enough to work. And I can still recall times when we'd go to the grocery store and my parents didn't have enough money to pay for all of the groceries that we had. And I remember my dad asking to speak to the store managers and making arrangements to pay for the remainder of our groceries the next day, once he would gather some more money. And I tell this story to demonstrate the need for my parents, 5 younger children, to work, because I'm sure that was not an easy decision for them to make. But I also tell this story because I want to highlight my parents' resourcefulness, their funds of knowledge. They were able to do their grocery shopping while leveraging their relationships and connections with grocery store managers. Status was not a barrier when it came to establishing strong connections with the community. And if anything, their undocumented status further propelled my family to establish these types of connections. So back to my cherry picking story, aside from the struggle of having to be up at 4 or 5 a.m. To get ready for the workday, the other struggles that my siblings and I faced were that we were literally the worst cherry pickers in my family, from our other cousins, my other uncles and aunts, but I always came in last. We would drag our feet, we would complain, we'd throw cherries at each other. We made sure that, we tried to mess around as much as we could. And then when I was eventually old enough to carry an 8-step ladder, because we need a ladder for cherry picking, I made sure I would drag that through the orchards. I wanted to make it known that I did not like this type of work at all. But there was an even worse part about orchard work, and that was the spiders. I don't know how many of you have worked within agriculture, if maybe you've cut asparagus, you've picked apples or cherries, but there's a lot of insects out there, particularly spiders. And I'm very afraid of spiders. And every single day as I get ready to strap on my cherry bucket, I would begin thinking about all of the spiders that were just hanging out in the branches of the cherry trees. And I would make sure that when I was getting ready to work, I would put my ladder in a certain way so that if a spider were to fall from a branch and it would fall on me in my cherry bucket, I could quickly jump off my ladder and run away without having to run into another cherry branch. I always had an escape plan. And this was especially frustrating for my parents because it made me an even slower cherry picker, but I was also disrupting their workday because they would have to constantly come to my rescue when a spider would fall inside my cherry bucket. And I refused to keep working until I knew that the spider had been removed from near me. So I think this gives you an idea of my feelings towards orchard work. And I want to highlight this resume format that I have of my very first job. Agricultural work, it was used in a negative way to promote college when I was in high school. I had certain teachers that would say, make sure you go to college because you don't want to end up like your parents. Agricultural work was seen through a deficit lens. And for a while, I perpetuated that narrative as well. I could never picture the work I did on a resume. So for this presentation, I want to highlight the type of skills that go into this work. My very first job of being a cherry picker is worthy of being on a resume. And this work is also an example of the funds of knowledge of my undocumented family. This is skilled labor, it's not unskilled labor. Now, while I shared some of the things I disliked about working in agriculture, there was one part of the day that I loved. It was the highlight of my cherry picking career, and that's lunchtime or lonche time. And this is something my siblings and I also enjoyed. We would help my mom make tortillas every morning before work, and we would pack tacos de frijoles or bean tacos or any other type of tacos into a thermos. I don't know if you've had tacos del termo, that's what we call them, but they're delicious. And sometimes if we got lucky, we'd also have a Gatorade, chips, or a Lunchable too. Lunchtime was the best time because it meant we could take off our cherry buckets. They had been heavy with cherries. We'd take them off. We'd flip them upside down to form a chair. We would take off our bandanas that had been covering our nose, our mouths. We'd cover our hair as well because there's a lot of pesticides and dust. And then from our fingers, we'd be able to remove the sports tapes that we had. We would wear sports tapes so that we wouldn't get blisters while picking cherries. And we could just talk and hang out. I loved lunchtime. It was also a time for our other family members, our primas, our primos, our uncles and aunts. They'd come out and hang out with us as well, but there was a lot of judging going on. They would judge the amount of cherry boxes that we had picked. We would compare how many have we made. And my siblings and I always had half of whatever my other cousins had. And I was the one who always came in last. And I think the judgment from my family was just as bad as the spiders that I would encounter. I didn't like being compared to my other cousins who were my age and were making twice as many cherry boxes as me. I would struggle to pick about $20 worth of cherries in one day. However, working in agriculture, it taught me the value of $1. I always knew how much physical work went into everything that we bought at home. But once I realized that I was the worst cherry picker there ever was, I started creating my plan to part ways with the field, with the cherry orchards. And I came to find jobs that I could do that didn't involve a daily fight with spiders. So here's a list of the side hustles that I had while growing up. One of these, though, I didn't actually do. So if you want to look through there and maybe like think to yourselves, which side hustle didn't Elena have? I'm going to take a water break while y'all think about that. So the side hustle that I didn't actually have was wearing a chicken suit for a restaurant that sold pollo asado. I did work at that restaurant, but when they asked if I wanted to wear the chicken suit, I was like, no, like that's where I drew the line and established my boundaries. But I want to share a story about this one, selling Avon out of a grocery cart. So one of my aunts sold Avon, which is like beauty products, makeup, clothes, and people would place orders through a catalog. She'd get the orders at her house, and then we'd help her pack up the orders. My aunt didn't know how to drive at the time. So what we would do was take these orders that were put in like paper bags, and we'd put them in a grocery cart, and then we deliver these orders via a grocery cart down the streets of Mattawa. And not even the streets, like the roads, they had a lot of potholes. So it was really hard to like push a grocery cart down the actual road. So we would use like the side road, which had like gravel, and it was still really hard to like push a grocery cart down the side of the road. But looking back, like, it's just like so funny, like, wow, I was actually doing that. But as I share these jobs with you now, it feels surreal to think about my journey in being financially independent. My parents worked very hard in the fields, and I felt responsible for purchasing my own school clothes and my own school supplies and helping pay for fees like my ASB cards or my cell phone bill. And I also know that if I were to ever be out of work, I wouldn't think twice about going back to working at a grocery store or a gas station or a food stand. I'm no longer ashamed of these jobs, but instead I talk about them with pride. These jobs actually taught me a lot about communication skills and professionalism and responsibility, but it took me a while to give them the credit that they deserved. Again, I was previously looking at these types of jobs as like through a deficit-based perspective, the way I had seen agricultural work. I have done very hard jobs, and that's actually what led me to making sure that I would pursue college, my higher education. And this is where my UndocuJoy defining moment number 2 begins, my realization of #forever a student. And I say forever a student because at one point that was my Instagram handle, and I was very proud of it. And while I wasn't good at orchard work, I found that I was really good at school. And I loved the positive feedback I received from my teachers compared to the negative criticism I received after only making 4 crates of cherries in the orchards. And going to college was something I heard about over and over again throughout kindergarten through 12th grade. So I knew that I was going. I just didn't really know all the details about college. That changed when one of my older sisters went to Eastern Washington University, and I see my sister as my role model. She did the research on going to college as an undocumented student, and when it was my turn, I pretty much did everything she had done. I applied to Eastern, I applied to like the same scholarships she had, and just like her, I had all of my 7 years at Eastern paid for, and that included my undergraduate degree and my master's degree. And this is another example of funds of knowledge, but this time it was my sister using her knowledge and resources to guide me in the college going process. This is also an example of familismo in how my sister was dedicated and committed to supporting me in my higher education goals. And finally, this is an example of collective agency because I did not make this journey alone. In addition to familial support, I had my high school teachers writing letters of recommendation for me, guiding me through writing scholarship essays. I had teachers who were aware of my undocumented status, so they acted as mentors in helping me find resources. My high school counselor shared knowledge about accessing in-state tuition, which is HB 1079, and That's a policy that allows in-state tuition for undocumented individuals. So I want to emphasize those three tenets in my hashtag Forever a Student journey: funds of knowledge, familismo, and collective agency. And here I have Mr. Watres, my high school teacher, Mr. Marlowe, and then my older sister, Criselia. And I know that the path I took isn't the path that everyone will take, but it's what was best for me at the time. I had the funding needed to attend Eastern Washington University, and I'm so glad I followed through with it. And one thing I'm especially proud of is getting $93,000 in scholarships to pay for my tuition. And I was able to graduate from college debt-free, and that was as an undocumented student. It was not easy, but it was worth it. And another reason I think I graduated with no debt is I didn't even look into loans as an option. I wasn't sure if we could even apply for loans, so I did not pursue that route. And I also had the opportunity to participate in a pageant, and I was crowned Miss Eastern. So I was a homecoming queen at Eastern Washington University in 2011. And this is like something I'm really proud of, because in high school, I was never homecoming queen or prom queen. So when I became homecoming queen at Eastern, I was like, cool, like I made it. And then in 2014, I had the opportunity to stand behind Governor Jay Inslee as he signed the Real Hope Act into law, which is now known as WASFA. And this bill is what provides undocumented students access to financial aid in Washington state. And I think this is one of the reasons that I'm a huge advocate for stepping out of your comfort zone and putting yourself in spaces that you never really pictured you could be in. And I share these things with you because it took me a while to see the potential in myself. I had a lot of doubt about what I could accomplish. Growing up as a student of color, a young girl who was often overworked and not paid enough, I didn't realize how much potential I had. However, through strong networks of support, such as my college professors, college advisors, and a vast network of undocumented leaders and allies in Washington state, I was able to participate in spaces where people who looked like me didn't often participate in. And while this does highlight my own agency, it also demonstrates the power of collective agency. And I want to share more about my experience in being a first-generation college student. So if you're the first person in your family to attend college, for example, neither parent or guardian attended college, then you're considered first gen. And in this story, I want to highlight the importance of familismo as a first-generation Latina student. I remember my freshman year of college, driving myself 2 hours to Eastern, and that's located in Cheney, to begin my first semester of college. And I initially thought of this drive as one that I took by myself because neither my parents nor my siblings were able to accompany me. One of my sisters was already in Cheney waiting for me. But now that I reflect on this drive, I was actually not alone, because in the backseat of my car was a cooler, a hielera, that my mom had packed with food. And inside this hielera, there was tortillas, there was homemade Mexican food, and several other snacks like galletas Marias. And for the 7 years that I was at Eastern, I could always count on taking this hielera full of food to Cheney whenever I visited Mattawa. Even now, when I fly to Washington for the weekend, my mom makes sure to send me back to Arizona with homemade bread, queso from Mexico. If you're from Mexico, you may have an understanding of like the importance of Mexican cheese and like how our families will pack coolers of cheese from Mexico and bring it to the US. So I always felt special when my mom would like send me to Arizona with queso from Mexico. They would send apples and any other food item that I could fly with in the airport. And I have pictures here of like some of the tacos con queso that my mom has made, bread and that famous Mexican cheese. And then one of the many hieleras that my mom gave me, this one was actually in grad school, I remember that. But my mom never let me go hungry. And my parents were not able to support me financially, but they showed their support in other ways. For example, a cooler full of food. And I see this as another example of their funds of knowledge, their ability to provide me with nourishment, with home-cooked meals to motivate me as I pursued my studies. And I was the type of student who would have loved to have my family close by as I went to college, However, homemade tortillas, tacos, and pan were the next best thing. And I also want to highlight the support that was offered to me by my brother. He had not graduated high school or attended college himself, but he offered his support by providing me with a used car while I went to college, which was a very generous act of familismo. And as college educators or community members, it can be easy to make the judgment that Latino parents or families might not be as involved in their college students' lives because they can't go and like drop them off at college, or they can't attend events, or they're not present at events like family weekend or parent programs, as was the case with me and like several other of my family members who were in college. But I'm here to tell you that there was support in the form of a hielera and home cooked meals, or a card that's been passed down from a sibling. So I want to ask, let's reevaluate the way that we measure parental or familial involvement in college. And this next story is about not being able to cross the border. I mean, I could cross the border, I could leave the United States, but when I was undocumented, I wouldn't be able to come back. And here's a list of all of the different states that I visited. So since becoming a resident, I have been able to go to Mexico. That's a journey I have yet to share publicly, but I have been able to do that, and it's been a very powerful one. But when I think about the places that I traveled to when I was undocumented and documented, I think back to the word UndocuJoy. And one reason that I felt the need to travel is because I was undocumented and I refused to stay put in one place. I wanted to feel freedom in the sense of traveling between states. And I didn't let my lack of legal status define me. The first time that I was ever on an airplane, I was going from Spokane to Seattle, and like I was amazed by the whole thing. At that moment when the plane was taking off and it was leaving the ground and like things were starting to get smaller, I felt like every single person that I know should like be here with me on this plane experiencing this, to be able to look out an airplane window and see the world from this perspective. I had my head glued to that window for like the full 1 hour flight. And flying provided me with the ability to go between state borders and also cross oceans, as I was able to go to Hawaii and also Puerto Rico. And I remember when I first saw some of my undocumented friends in Puerto Rico through Facebook, and I reached out to them, and then my sister and I did our own research, and we learned that you could go to Puerto Rico if you're undocumented, documented. We were able to do it with like our driver's license and then our DACA permit. You don't have to be a US citizen to actually go. So this is another example of the funds of knowledge exhibited by the undocumented community. We were able to do our research and learn about the places that we could travel. And I also want to share my journey in therapy. So my journey in therapy has been one of learning to challenge the dominant systems that I felt intimidated by growing up without legal status. So for example, one reason that I sought out therapy is because I was tired of feeling anxious and scared about sharing my story. I wanted to feel brave. And the second reason that I sought out therapy was to regain my sense of agency in society. Even though I was a resident, when I got my green card, I still felt undocumented in the sense that I was still afraid of people who were in certain positions of power. And there were certain white individuals, depending on like what positions of power they had, that still intimidated me. And this was because of prior negative interactions with certain white individuals when I was growing up or in college as well. And previous dominant systems or spaces where I would constantly feel undocumented were offices in higher education that dealt with like finances, or offices that required like certain legal documentations, in addition to like certain classes in college, and then in the workplace as well, where the majority of students and colleagues were white. And I was one of a few students of color. So like, I just felt different. But I was having a hard time understanding, like, why don't I feel like whatever an individual with legal status is supposed to feel like? I'm like, wait, that didn't happen. Like, I got my green card. Like, how come I still feel undocumented? And upon speaking with my therapist, I came to the realization that having been undocumented for 25 years, it impacted me in more ways than I had thought. And I now continue to access therapy, but this time it has been through U of A. They have therapy services as well. So this is also like a PSA for anyone that's a college student. Reach out to like your counseling and psychological services, or if you're an advocate, maybe do that research on behalf of undocumented or documented communities to learn about like what sessions students can get, if they're free, if there's a payment, what that process is like. So in the following slides, I'll be sharing some tools that I have found very helpful from seeking out therapy. So I want to talk about the phrases that you see on this slide, and I apologize for not having the exact name for these. I learned about them through cognitive behavioral therapy, and I previously mentioned how being undocumented was difficult. And I also discussed like some of the jobs that I had growing up where I was underpaid. But prior to therapy, I was afraid of saying no. I had never said no to any type of job opportunity that came my way because I still had that mindset of being grateful for any job that came up. In my mind, if it was not physical labor, it was a good job offer. And I'm going to draw your attention to number 10 on this list. I have a right to say no. Saying no doesn't make me bad or selfish. Since starting therapy, I have said no to so many things. I even said no to a job offer once, and that was something that I had never done before, ever. So as an undergrad student, I was constantly like overbooking myself. I would say yes to every single opportunity that came my way. I wouldn't think twice about it. And at times, there were times when like I wanted to say no. I would say yes to like being on a panel at 9 a.m. And then I would cry because I was like sharing a lot of like my trauma that I had experienced. I was being very vulnerable with the audience. And then, you know, panel at 9 a.m. and then at 10 a.m. you have class. So it was really hard for me to like mentally focus in class because I was still like recovering from that experience of sharing my story and being very vulnerable. So number 10 is a right that I'm happy to put in practice because saying no to some things has meant saying yes to myself. And as I continued therapy in my first year, I found myself constantly referring back to my list of 14 rights as a way to continue advocating for myself. And I actually have these here. I have these on my desk. And every week, like I go through these. If I feel like something is wrong, I'll notice myself like going through my cards more often. But it's also a good way to like guide conversations in therapy as well. And I'm going to do a brief overview about unhelpful thinking styles. So I previously mentioned one that I continue to work on is catastrophization, but this is a worksheet you can find online. If you Google like unhelpful thinking styles, cognitive distortions, this is often what's initially talked about when you go to therapy. There's different versions of these worksheets, but I would recommend like maybe looking at this as well if you're considering doing therapy and wondering like maybe what are some things you want to work on. And then this is the feelings wheel. This is also something that my therapist shared with me. So in the middle, you have some of like the feelings that we tend to describe, like we're feeling happy, angry, sad. But as you work your way towards the outside of the circle, you're able to better label what it is you're experiencing. So maybe you're not sad. Maybe what you're actually feeling is disappointment. But this was also a good way for me to just like label what it is that I'm feeling and work through like some of those thoughts that I was having when I was like, why don't I feel like whatever a documented person is supposed to feel like? And this image is from feelingswheel.com. There's also several versions of this type of feelings wheel. And I also want to provide book recommendations to further support learning as it relates to asset-based perspectives in education and further understanding the diverse experiences within immigrant communities. So the first one is We Are Not Dreamers. It's focused on theory, and it's actually written by undocumented or formerly undocumented scholars. And it's shifting the perspective from one where research is done on undocumented individuals to now undocumented individuals theorizing our lives and being agents of our stories and producing scholarly work. And then Funds of Knowledge is a theory-based book. It's honoring students' cultural experiences and resources as strengths. In The Country We Love, Diane Guerrero, she's actually the voice of Isabela on Encanto. She details her experience of coming home from school one day and realizing her parents had been taken by immigration. They were placed in a detention center and then later deported. So this book highlights her story of navigating life while experiencing family separation. The book, Tell Me How It Ends, the author details experiences of working with unaccompanied minors from Central America as their cases are being processed, with the outcomes of being either reunited with their family in the US or being sent back to their country. So I want to share this book to highlight the multifaceted experiences within immigration. And then My Underground American Dream, the author is a formerly undocumented individual, and she recounts her experience of having worked in Wall Street while undocumented. So these are books that all provide more insight into the complex immigration process. And I also want to share them because I've been in spaces where people are like, we don't know where you can begin learning. And the expectation is often like someone that's undocumented doing the teaching. And that's a great way if you're comfortable with that. But there are resources out there. And this is a great way to start learning. And I want to end with some UndocuJoy reflections. So the first one is reflect on your narrative regarding the undocumented community. Is it an asset-based or is it a deficit-based perspective? The second one, consider how you can further support the undocumented community. What would this look like in your current organization? What dominant systems might need to be restructured? And one example I want to share here is when I was an undergraduate student at Eastern Washington University, I was accepted to become an orientation leader. And the orientation coordinator was able to turn what would have been like actual pay as an employee. He turned that into a stipend for me so that I could still work, even though I had no valid social security number. So he was able to challenge this like dominant system of the way student jobs work in college. And he created like this stipend. He worked with a professor on campus to help me with that. So that's an example, again, of like collective agency. And then find your UndocuJoy. What's your story? That's another reflection for you all. And I want to end by acknowledging some of the people who continue to support me in everything I do. That's my husband, my family, and my mentors. And while my mentors are not part of my direct family, in college, they became part of my extended network of support, a network of familismo. And I say this because part of the funds of knowledge that were exhibited by my family was the importance of networks of support. And I was able to recreate that at Eastern Washington University. And I'm working on that at U of A as well. But I want to end by acknowledging that where I'm at today in my PhD program has also been the result of a vast network of individuals who, through collective agency, have provided letters of recommendation and support, and they continue to act as my cheerleaders today. And these are strengths that we can all act on to continue supporting undocumented individuals, first-generation students, and students of color in their journeys towards higher education and journeys towards finding their own UndocuJoy. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I believe there is a Q&A at this time.
Thank you so much, Elena, for an amazing presentation. I'm here with Alex. Together, we're going to coordinate and facilitate the Q&A. Alex, do you want to say a few words before we get started?
Yes. Thank you so much, Elena, for sharing about your story and about your journey of exploring, how you've explored your experiences and you've tried to find like the positive in all of in what you've experienced. Yeah. So we will start by reading some of the questions. And so a question that is in the Q&A right now is Jessica Oskoy asked, where do you recommend undocu persons to explore? Sorry, let me read this again. Where do you recommend undocu persons to look for persons of color therapists that actually understand the UndocuJoy experience?
And I had a website in a previous presentation. I know there's actually a website in Washington that's specifically for like therapists of color who understand like our unique experiences. I don't have that. I can't think of the word right now or like the actual title, but as someone that started seeking out therapy, I noticed as well, like if you go through your health insurance, through work, if you have health insurance, you could set filters. Like if you want someone that speaks Spanish, if you want someone that's bilingual, you can select like different types of boxes to kind of filter that. And after spending some time with my therapist the first time, I realized like our time is done. Like I feel like she helped me out at first. And since then I have actually had a therapist who's a person of color, and that was assigned to me through the university. And I could see there was like a huge difference in how I'm able to like explore that trauma that like I wasn't doing before. So there is this importance. It's important to find therapists who can relate to us. Because I have been able to do like so much in like 5 therapy sessions that I've had with this therapist compared to like the 2 years that I was with my first one. So I don't know if like someone can share the link. If they're able to find that, that would be great. Or like put the link as a question in the Q&A.
We'll see if we can find that, Elena. Thank you so much. We have a second question also from Jessica. Once you become a U.S. citizen, are you able to sponsor your parents to become permanent residents?
So I know that would be the case with my family. My brother actually became a citizen before me, and he was the one who sponsored my parents. So my parents are now both permanent residents. And it's just been like a huge difference in how we've gone about our lives. Like there's still some fear when like they're crossing borders, like they're going from Mexico through the airport. So like that fear doesn't go away. And I know my dad is usually questioned when he's crossing at airports. Like they do pull him aside and they're always asked additional questions. So like we still have this fear, like, oh, like what if something bad happens? But it's been like there's so much peace of mind in knowing like your parents have that sense of protection. But if my brother would not have been a U.S. citizen, then yes, I would be able to do that for my parents. And I also want to share that when my brother was a citizen, he did put in a petition for my siblings and I, and that's a 14-year-long wait. And that was in like 2015. So we would still be waiting on that type of process. Thank you for that question.
Alex, do you want to take the next question?
Yes. Daniela asked, did you ever experience fear that someone would report you? And if you ever told them that you were undocumented? And if so, how did you handle or cope with that anxiety?
Yes, so actually, like there was a time when I stopped doing public speaking for because of that reason. I had family saying like, you need to be careful. You know, people, like you can't trust everyone. And for a while, like I got quiet because I was scared. I was like, oh my gosh, they're going to deport me. Like I've been very visible about my status. I started thinking about like my other family members who were undocumented and how I felt like I was being selfish when I was talking about my status. So I did like shy away from it for a bit. And it wasn't until like I became a resident that I like started being more vocal. That fear is there. I feel like that's part of like the catastrophization, like, oh my gosh, someone's gonna deport me. What my therapist said, and I feel like this can help, but I don't think she fully understood like the extent to what undocumented people go through. But one thing she helped me with when I had like unhelpful thinking patterns is asking, is this thought helpful? Is it helpful to be thinking that I'm going to be deported? And then is it accurate? In my mind, I would say, yeah, it could be accurate, but it hasn't really happened to people. So what she would say, if your answer is no to, is this thought helpful? Is this thought accurate? Then like, that's how you work through that, like unhelpful thinking or unhelpful thought. And that started, like whenever I started like thinking like, oh my gosh, like even today I'm like, oh my gosh, what if like my internet goes out? What if like there's a Zoom bomber? I was like, okay, Elena, stop. Like, is this thought helpful? Like, no, it's not helpful to think about that. Is it accurate? Like, well, it could happen, but most likely it won't. So that's what has helped me. And knowing too, like, I would think I have like this huge, strong network of people in Washington, like allies, people who are very aware or familiar with immigration law. So I would think like, okay, if I do get put in a detention center, like hopefully my community will like come out and rally and like help me like come out of those deportation proceedings.
Thank you. And we're so sorry you weren't able to make it in person. I'll just say that because we knew that part of the reason that we would love to have you is that you were coming home, but COVID made it happen. I just want to mention and thank Sarah Calvin-Stupfel, who's actually one of our student workers. She did find one website and she wonders if it's the correct one. It's www.multiculturalcounselors.org in the state of Washington. And then Cynthia Hernandez also chimed in saying that Psychology Today is a website in which you can use the filters. Because we don't have the chat function today, we won't be able to share that information with you, but we'll make sure that it's made available to people after this webinar. So we have a next question for you, which is what, and I'm very curious about this question too, as someone who's worked on reframing, but what helped you shift your feelings from embarrassed to prideful when talking about your previous job? So it's related to the reframing.
I think it started when, like, so first I learned about UndocuJoy, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, no way, there's a new way we can talk about ourselves. Like, it doesn't just have to be like about trauma. And one thing, like, I used to always like break down in tears when like talking about my story of crossing the border. It was traumatic. And what I learned in therapy is vulnerability is earned. I'm not saying that I don't, like, there will be spaces where I will cry and I'm okay with that. But other times I was like, that left me feeling like uneasy, and I would just like think about it the whole day. And I was like, man, like I need a spa day to work through this. And I started, when I learned about the word UndocuJoy, I was thinking about when my siblings and I would pick cherries, there was so much play that was going on. Like during the lunch hour, like, we would send tacos to each other, like down the rows of trees, like, hey, this taco's like from, my cousin down 2 rows. I remember like we'd cut up cherries and throw them at each other. So like when they hit you, like they would stain your face or your clothes. So I was thinking like, they're like the cherry orchards. It was a hard experience. But when I think about it, like there was so much family bonding that was going on at that time. And this was something that I hadn't shed light on before because I didn't think anyone wanted to hear it. Or the narrative around this time was like, well, it was also like there was strategic things going on to try to get like the DREAM Act passed. So I understand why our narratives were that way, like doom and gloom. But hearing the word UndocuJoy, it really, I felt like I had permission to do this. I was seeing like Luis Ortega and Frank Navarro, who, are close friends of mine, starting to like tell stories with this. And I was like, like I'm a funny person. Like I've had some good stories in my life. Like I want to bring this aspect of myself into the space, because before I don't feel like I was fully there. Whereas now I feel like I'm honoring more of my full self than before.
Thank you, Elena. Alex, do you want to do the next question?
Yes, so I actually have a question myself. So what is some advice you would share with someone who wants to explore their UndocuJoy journey?
So one thing I would say is, if there's a way you've been thinking about like sharing your story, but that you've been holding back, like look more into that. So for me, it was writing. Like I loved writing, but all of my essays like that I had written before about myself were from like this place of like, overcoming a lot of barriers. So that's when I created a blog. I'm like, I'm a very creative person. I love writing. So I started writing about the experiences I had like working in the orchards, but adding like a little bit of humor, putting words in Spanish, which I also felt like I hadn't really been doing before. When I'm asked to share a story, like, I think, what is it that I want to share? how can I honor myself? How can I make sure that it's bringing joy? And even in writing this presentation, I actually reached out to one of my professors to review it. And he told me, like, when you talk about healing, like, it almost seems like you're doing it as if there's something wrong with you and you need to fix that problem. He's like, what you're doing is like, you're challenging these dominant systems that like made you feel that way. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, like the problem isn't me. It's the system. So I think like catching yourself when you do things like that, like I reframed my narrative in ways like after seeing that feedback, I was like, okay, let me change the language here. But I guess being creative is another way too. Like my Instagram, I've tried to add just like more things that show me experiencing joy. Whereas before I felt like it had to be very centered around like my activist self, overcoming trauma, overcoming barriers. And now I'm like, let me share this picture of this hike, or let me write about my hikes like in a blog, because I felt like I wasn't able to do that before. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. We have another question from Rebecca. Did you ever feel like you were striving to make your parents' familias efforts worth it instead of working hard in school for yourself?
Yes. And even now I still feel like, I think I don't feel as much of like that sense of responsibility. And it might be with also being like the youngest in my family, that like my older siblings will probably feel that responsibility a little bit more than me. But I always felt like it's going to be up to me. Like I'm going to go to school. I'm going to financially support my parents. I'm doing a PhD program now, so I'm not able to do that yet. I'm still in school. But I did feel like this huge sense of responsibility to my family. My older sister, she moved out of state. She went to Washington, D.C. And like, I think my siblings and I almost saw that as a betrayal. Like, how dare you leave our family? Like, how dare you leave us and abandon us? And then we saw she was very happy in Washington, D.C. She did eventually go back to Washington. And when that happened, it was like, good, you came back to us. And then I left Washington. And even now I almost feel like I betrayed my family a little bit for not being there. But I feel like I can be in this state because my older siblings are there for my parents. Whereas if I didn't have them, I think I would feel like this greater sense of responsibility to like be there. And even though my parents right now are good, they're able to like financially support themselves. I still feel like we almost become like our parents' guardians. They're protectors.
Thank you. I have a question for you, Elena. I'm really struck by your educational narrative and how it weaves in your life story. And now you're doing a PhD in higher ed, having done like an undergrad and in public health and then media. And now you've chosen higher ed, and then you have all of this life experience and deep knowledge about reframing and therapeutic processes. So I wondered, what is it you're thinking of doing with the higher ed degree, or what do you see your trajectory being? I know you're just a first year person in a PhD program, but how do you envision your trajectory moving forward?
So that's a great question. And I've been thinking about that. And in the fall, I had a class on qualitative research. So it's like interviewing individuals, and then you take their responses and you analyze them. But what I actually did was analyze a thesis that I wrote when I was doing my master's degree in communication studies. And as I was analyzing the interviews that I had with undocumented students from Eastern, I realized that I was almost writing from like this deficit-based perspective. And I was writing about it. I was looking at like, how has financial aid like supported your education? How has in-state tuition like made education possible for you? But I was looking at it from the perspective of these systems have allowed you to succeed. So like, how are you successful? And I wrote it from that perspective. And looking back at my answers, I realized that in a lot of students' responses, they alluded to like staff, faculty, and their families actually being like the source of like motivation needed to pursue college. So whether financial aid in Washington state passed, they were going to pursue higher education either way. Like that policy didn't open up this pathway. Like it did make it easier. So I was looking at it and I was like, oh my gosh, like I was even looking at it from like this white savior perspective, like policies are going to save you. So how has that happened? And I was thinking to myself how like, oh my gosh, if I would have had financial aid, that would have made my life so much easier. But I was still going to be in school regardless of that. So part of being in a higher ed program is having my like being challenged of my own thought processes, because like that's how I've been, like I was taught kind of to like think that way, like these policies are saving us, kind of like DACA, like it saved us, but it's like, no, it didn't save us. Like it, like we fought for it. So it's challenging the way I tell stories, and then making sure that like when I work with undocumented students, or when it comes to like being interviewed, that it's not doing work on students, it's doing work like with undocumented individuals. In higher education too, like the way one of my mentors at Eastern was able to create like that stipend-based program for me. I want to bring like more knowledge about that. Like we can restructure these systems that are in place, like almost doing like an audit, like what systems are in place that are preventing maybe like undocumented students from doing this job, or you say you're inclusive, but really like how inclusive are these policies? Are there alternatives that we can do? So that's something that I've thought about for sure.
Great. Well, I wish you all the best, and I'm hearing at the end that thinking about what the barriers are really important. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think Alex has another question for us.
Yes. So Professor Emily Davidson said, "Gracias, Elena, Alex, Tamara. This has been a powerful session." And she said, "Elena, I wonder what advice you have for professors, mentors, staff in supporting undocumented students in seeking UndocuJoy. So often we are maybe too focused on resolving issues and may unintentionally catastrophize. How do we say this word? Sorry, I'm."
I think catastrophize.
Yes. Sorry. As we try to offer support.
That's one thing that I feel like I'm still like working on that, and part of it is like we're all so different, like from where we're coming from. So I think maybe some students like don't want to have professors like feeling sorry for them, and they want resources. They don't want them to be like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And like I've heard this where a student like shared her story, and like her faculty started crying, and she was like, "Now I was comforting this faculty. Like what the heck?" So I think like listen to the students that you're working with if they like asked for help. Another thing too is like think about your syllabus. Like what's the language in your syllabus? When it comes to office hours, like are they inviting? When I think about like being a first generation student, I was very intimidated by a lot of my professors. And the expectation is like, you should go and seek out your professor. Like that's what you should do to be successful in college. And I didn't always do that. Like I was intimidated. So like, this isn't just for undocumented students, but maybe like first gen students of color, minoritized students. Like how can you become like maybe more accessible, more like less intimidating? But also when it comes to like, if you're sharing something about like recent events, like, or I guess acknowledging what's going on as well, like acknowledging what's going on in the world. I remember when I was like sitting in my office at ASU when they canceled, when the first time that DACA was terminated, and like nobody was talking about this. And I was like, well, as a staff member, this impacts me. Like, what about your students? Like, I just kept thinking like, what about the students that we're working with? How are they being impacted? Is anyone talking about it? Is anyone like acknowledging that they might be going through some struggles? So I think just also like acknowledging that. If you're doing like literature, if you teach something with literature or writing, maybe bring in these types of concepts like funds of knowledge, like think about it through this perspective. Bring in UndocuJoy as well. And that's one reason I also started like reframing my stories. It was just this past year I learned about funds of knowledge, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this theory really honors my family. And there's also ways that you can incorporate funds of knowledge through curriculum. So one example was like, if you're doing a lesson on agriculture, can you like take an apple and then use an apple, like talk about the region that it's from, who may have picked it, and then maybe incorporate something with economics, like where is it going to end up? So there's different ways to like with funds of knowledge, there's actually a lot of curriculum information on that. So I think I'll end with that. Maybe incorporate funds of knowledge into curriculum building too.
Thank you so much, Elena. I think we only have time for one question, and then I'll thank you. And I'm, along with other faculty members at PLU, have actively supported our GOLD group, which is our undocumented student group, which Alex is the current president of, which is very exciting. But I wonder, from the point of view of a collective or a kind of organizing perspective, I know that it would be institution specific, but what do you think should be on the minds of our students and on the staff's mind in terms of what should be some of our priorities moving forward?
From my personal perspective, I think funding is something that would have helped me in so many ways. And I used to think of like Eastern Washington University as a place that like gave me so much support. And I was like, they were the best. They were so inclusive. Looking back, like, I think there was maybe like 2 specific scholarships I received from Eastern. The rest were all from outside departments. And I realized like the institution as a whole didn't really support me. It was like specific individuals. And I was reading an article about a university in California where faculty and staff and like student allies actually created like a coalition, and they worked with churches and other organizations to come up with funding for undocumented students, like to have that ready. And I say this with funding because I feel like that's like, it might not seem like, oh, like that's not very like a hard thing to come up with, but like funding really was like the biggest barrier for me when I was a student. But having people who like have legal status, like faculty, I know, and you know, they're powerful voices, and allies, like where students themselves aren't having to be vulnerable and advocate for themselves, like that's a great way to show support, to show allyship, but also like provide advocacy and actually do something, like not just say like we're being supportive, but hey, we're being supportive and we have this funding. So if you need to access, you know, healthcare and you don't have the fees to pay for it, here they are. If parking, you know, I know some universities, like you have to pay for parking, like that's also a great way like to reduce a barrier. So students, I think when you're documented, like you're experiencing that legal status like as a barrier in certain ways. So removing like financial barriers is just another way to help students really focus on like just being a student.
Thanks, Elena. So I think we're at the end of our time. For those folks that are sticking with us, we have a bit of a break, and starting at about 11:50, we have our next session, which is a mother and son's healing journey through gender transformation. And I just want to let folks know that we look forward to seeing you shortly. And Elena, I just want to express our gratitude for your being here with us today on behalf of the Wong Center and Pacific Lutheran University. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you be part of our community.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, I appreciate you all. Thank you so much.
Hopefully we'll have you here in person, but I think Alex has something to say too.
Yes, Elena, muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. I really appreciated your talk and your experience of how you've explored your UndocuJoy journey today.
Thank you, Alex. I hope we can meet in person one day.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.